It doesn't start with a missile. It starts with a message. A shipping company quietly tells its tankers to stay out of a narrow stretch of water in the Middle East. Insurance premiums spike overnight. A refinery manager in South Korea starts calculating how many days of crude he has left. And somewhere on a trading floor in London, a number jumps. $90, then 92, then 95. The price of oil suddenly climbs to the highest level in 2 years. Not because supply has already collapsed, but because the world is realizing it might. Because one warning, just a few sentences long, has rattled the entire global economy. The energy minister of Qatar said something that sounded almost banal.
If the conflict in the region continues, all Gulf energy exporters may have to halt production and exports within days. Not reduce, not slow down, stop. And if ships cannot pass through the narrow Strait of Hormuz, oil could surge toward $150 a barrel within weeks. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What actually happens if the region that produces a huge share of the world's energy suddenly shuts down? And more importantly, is there any realistic way to resolve a crisis like this? Because the problem isn't just oil. It's how the entire global economy is wired around it. And that wiring is far more fragile than most people realize. Imagine a map of the global energy system. You might expect it to look complicated. Thousands of pipelines, hundreds of ports, dozens of major producers, a huge network spread across continents. But in reality, the system has a few choke points, and one of the most important is a thin strip of water barely 33 kilometers wide, the Strait of Hormuz. Every day, roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves through this single corridor.
Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar. Their oil and gas all pass through it. It is quite literally the artery of the global energy system. Now imagine that artery suddenly tightening. Not completely closed, just dangerous enough that tankers hesitate, insurance companies panic, shipping firms pull back. That alone can freeze the system. Because energy markets don't wait for shortages to happen. They react to the possibility of shortages. That's why oil prices have already surged to a 2-year high after the warning from Qatar. And the fear isn't theoretical. Conflict in the region has already disrupted shipments and damaged infrastructure, forcing producers to cut output and slowing tanker traffic through the strait. In other words, the global oil system is starting to stutter. And when it stutters, the consequences spread far beyond the Middle East. Here's the strange thing about oil. Most people think the price is determined by how much oil exists in the world.
But that's not really how it works. The world produces roughly 100 million barrels of oil per day, and the system is balanced with almost absurd precision. If supply drops by just 1 or 2%, prices can spike dramatically. Not because oil disappears overnight, but because the market has almost no spare capacity. Think of it like airline seats during holiday travel. When the plane is 98% full, losing a few seats doesn't just inconvenience passengers, it creates chaos. Oil works the same way. A few million barrels removed from the system can send prices soaring. And the Gulf region produces a huge portion of that supply. If exports there stopped even briefly, the shock would ripple through every major economy. Fuel prices would climb, shipping costs would rise, airlines would struggle, factories would slow. And inflation, The thing central banks around the world have been trying to tame for years could surge again. The Qatar warning is essentially a reminder of something the modern economy prefers to forget. Global growth still runs on oil. But the deeper issue isn't just production, it's logistics. Because even if oil wells keep pumping, that oil still has to move. Tankers, pipelines, storage terminals, refineries, every step in that chain is vulnerable. Take the Strait of Hormuz again. If ships can't pass safely, producers face an odd problem. They might still have oil underground. They might still be able to pump it, but they have nowhere to send it.
Steady. Storage tanks fill. Ports shut down. Production stops. And restarting oil systems is not like flipping a switch. Some wells can take weeks or months to return to normal flow after being shut down, which means even a short disruption can echo through the system for a long time. That's one reason energy analysts warn the crisis could cause long-term shocks to global energy markets, even if the conflict ends quickly. In other words, the damage isn't just about today's prices. It's about how fragile the infrastructure has become. So how did the global economy end up this exposed? Part of the answer is geography. The Middle East simply sits on enormous energy reserves. For decades, it has been one of the cheapest places in the world to produce oil, which means the system naturally evolved around it. Pipelines, refineries, shipping routes, trading hubs, everything grew outward from those fields. And over time, the world became dependent on the region in ways that are difficult to unwind. Asia imports a massive share of its crude from the Gulf. Europe relies heavily on liquefied natural gas shipments from producers like Qatar. Even the United States, which now produces huge amounts of oil domestically, still feels global price swings, because oil is a global market. If prices spike in Asia or Europe, they eventually ripple everywhere. So when Gulf supply is threatened, it isn't just a regional problem, it's a global one. Now here's where the story becomes a little ironic. For years, governments have talked about reducing dependence on Middle Eastern oil, energy independence, diversification, renewables, electric vehicles, all of it. And to some extent, those changes are real. The U.S. produces far more oil than it did 20 years ago. Renewable energy has grown rapidly. Electric vehicles are slowly replacing gasoline cars. But the uncomfortable truth is that the global system still relies heavily on the same supply routes. The transition away from oil is happening, just slowly. And the world still consumes tens of millions of barrels every day. Which means when something threatens the biggest supply region on Earth, markets panic. Not because the future belongs to oil, but because the present still does. So how do you resolve a crisis like this? There are really only a few possible paths, and none of them are easy. The first solution is the obvious one:
De-escalation. If the conflict cools and shipping lanes reopen, markets will relax quickly. Oil traders are extremely sensitive to geopolitical risk. When tensions rise, prices spike. When tensions fall, prices often retreat just as fast. That's why diplomatic pressure becomes so intense during energy crises. Governments know that calming the situation can stabilize markets almost immediately. But diplomacy is unpredictable, and sometimes conflicts escalate faster than negotiations can contain them, which leads to the second option: strategic reserves. Many countries maintain emergency oil stockpiles. The United States, China, Japan, and several European nations store millions of barrels specifically for supply disruptions. These reserves act like a shock absorber. If exports suddenly drop,
Governments can release oil into the market to slow price spikes. But reserves are temporary. They buy time. They don't solve the underlying supply problem. Which brings us to the third option, alternative supply. When prices rise high enough, producers outside the conflict zones start pumping more. U.S. shale companies, Canadian oil sands, Brazilian offshore fields, Norwegian North Sea production. Higher prices make previously expensive projects profitable. But this response takes time. Drilling new wells, expanding production, building infrastructure. None of it happens overnight. Energy markets can react instantly. Energy supply cannot. There is also a fourth, quieter solution: demand destruction. This is the least popular one, because it means the economy slows. When oil prices spike high enough, consumers drive less, factories reduce output, air travel becomes more expensive, growth cools. In other words, the market solves the shortage by reducing demand. It's effective, but painful. The oil crises of the 1970s showed exactly how disruptive that process can be. Inflation surged, economies stalled, and governments scrambled to redesign energy policy, which is why policymakers today are so nervous about any disruption that pushes oil prices sharply higher, because they've seen this movie before, and they remember how it ends. There's another strange twist in all of this. While high oil prices hurt many economies, they benefit others. Oil exporting countries earn enormous windfalls. Russia, for example, often profits when global prices rise. So do other producers outside the conflict zone.
Steady U.S. shale companies, Canadian oil sands, Brazilian offshore fields, Norwegian North Sea production. Higher prices make previously expensive projects profitable. But this response takes time. Drilling new wells, expanding production, building infrastructure. None of it happens overnight. Energy markets can react instantly. Energy supply cannot. There is also a fourth, quieter solution: demand destruction. This is the least popular one, because it means the economy slows. When oil prices spike high enough, consumers drive less, factories reduce output, air travel becomes more expensive, growth cools. In other words, the market solves the shortage by reducing demand. It's effective, but painful. The oil crises of the 1970s showed exactly how disruptive that process can be. Inflation surged, economies stalled, and governments scrambled to redesign energy policy, which is why policymakers today are so nervous about any disruption that pushes oil prices sharply higher, because they've seen this movie before, and they remember how it ends. There's another strange twist in all of this. While high oil prices hurt many economies, they benefit others. Oil exporting countries earn enormous windfalls. Russia, for example, often profits when global prices rise. So do other producers outside the conflict zone. Energy companies see profits surge. Oil traders thrive on volatility. In other words, a crisis for some countries can be a windfall for others, which makes resolving the situation even more complicated, because the incentives across the global system aren't aligned. Some players want stability, others quietly benefit from chaos. But perhaps the most interesting question is what happens after the crisis, because every energy shock leaves a long shadow. The 1970s oil crisis triggered fuel efficiency standards and strategic reserves. The 2000s price spike accelerated shale drilling in the United States. The 2022 energy shock pushed Europe to rapidly diversify gas supplies. Each crisis reshapes the system, and this one could do the same. Higher prices make renewable energy more attractive. They accelerate electric vehicle adoption. They encourage governments to rethink energy security. Ironically, the very shock created by oil dependence can speed up the transition away from it. But that transition is messy. It takes years, sometimes decades. And until it happens, the world remains vulnerable to the same choke points, the same shipping lanes, the same fragile balance between supply and demand.
So, the immediate question, how to resolve the current crisis, has several answers. Diplomacy to reduce conflict, strategic reserves to stabilize markets, alternative producers ramping up supply, consumers adjusting demand. Each piece helps, but none of them alone fixes the deeper problem. Because the real issue is structural. The global economy still runs on a resource concentrated in a few regions, moved through a handful of critical routes, priced in a market that reacts instantly to fear, which means every geopolitical shock has the potential to become an economic one. And that brings us back to the warning that started all of this. A single statement from Qatar's energy minister. If the conflict continues, Gulf exporters could halt production within days. Maybe that scenario never happens. Maybe diplomacy intervenes. Maybe shipping lanes reopen. Maybe markets calm down. But the reaction to that warning reveals something deeper. The global energy system isn't just about barrels of oil. It's about trust. Trust that tankers can sail safely. Trust that pipelines stay open. Trust that producers keep pumping. The moment that trust cracks, even slightly, the system trembles. Prices jump, governments panic, markets scramble. Because everyone suddenly remembers how dependent the world still is on a few fragile links in the chain. And the uncomfortable question that lingers beneath all of this is simple. If one narrow waterway can shake the entire global economy, what happens the next time that chain breaks?